came from. I've written 3 books about Asia, which might be my limit for now. I'll tell you, I may tell you later what else I'm working on. And the whole genesis of those books was that my girlfriend, who was my girlfriend then, was an exchange student in Indonesia for a year after high school. And then a few years after that, we decided, we were sort of in the midst of our university studies, but that we'd take a trip. We'd take a break from that and take a trip. So we spent more than a year traveling through Southeast Asia. Philippines and Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, a lot of time in Singapore, which sort of gave me enough sort of bits of information and conversations with people to put together a book of short stories, which came out 10 years ago, called Kingdom of Monkeys. And then one particular visit to the Changi War Museum in Singapore really got my mind working on a novel. Just with the idea that, well, I'd never written a novel up to that point, just lots of short stories, but that I could maybe kind of cheat a novel, because Changi was sort of the clearinghouse for all the prisoners of war that the Japanese captured during World War II, all the military personnel. So whether they were Dutch or Australian or British, whether they were captured in the Dutch East Indies or up in Malaya, they would all sort of come through Singapore. So at times there was 10,000 men there. There were sort of various shifts as guys came through, and they were sent to work in coal mines in Japan or out building the Death Railroad in Burma. So I thought, well, at various times there can be all these different guys, and they can all sit and tell their stories. It could be like the Decameron or something, and it would actually be a bunch of short stories, but I'd fool people and tell them it was a novel. And I could have all these Canadian soldiers there telling their stories about movies on Granville Street and apple orchards in Okanagan and things that I knew about. But then once I got home, I realized that there weren't any Canadian military personnel in Singapore that got as far as Hong Kong. Things went badly there, and the ones who were captured stayed in Hong Kong in the camps there. And you might say, well, you could probably have cheated and said that there were men in the Edmonton Grenadiers, but then you'd get angry letters from the Edmonton Grenadiers. So I didn't want to mess with that, but I did find that there were Canadian sailors, merchant seamen, on CPR ships that were being used as troop transport by the British Army. And in particular, the CPR ship Empress of Asia, which had originally sailed out of Vancouver almost a year before, was called from Bombay to help get refugees out of Singapore as the Japanese came down the Malay Peninsula. But they were a couple of days too late, and they were actually shelled by the Japanese and sunk, and then all the men aboard were captured. So this was my Canadian guy that could be in the camp. So I named him Harry Winslow, and I said that he grew up in Vernon just as I did, and then gave him sort of a backstory as to how he got onto the ship in the first place. But that was a few drafts in. It took me about 6 years to write that book, because initially I didn't really know, outside of having a Canadian in a prison camp, what it was going to be about. So I just sort of wrote a scene that I thought might be the beginning. It turned out it was the middle, so I wrote another 200 pages before, another 200 pages after. And the feedback that I got from various friends was that the narrative voice wasn't that good. And that, which might not sound like a big deal, but it's basically every word needs to be rewritten. So that's sort of where the 6 years came from. So when I approached, I thought, for my next book, I will have an outline. I will have some idea of what I'm doing before I start. So even before Empress of Asia was finished, I was on a book tour for Kingdom of Monkeys with Stephen Galloway, another writer from the interior. And I think it was 2003 or 4, and we were in Kamloops, and his car broke down. You may be wondering, where is this all going? And his car was up on the hoist in a garage in Kamloops, and I was washing my hands in the bathroom, and had this idea, for whatever reason, and we all have these sort of half-baked images of things, but it's kind of my job to pay attention to these things, and you get enough of them, and then you can make a book out of it. I had this idea of a woman in big whalebone hoop skirts walking up a muddy path, thatched hut village somewhere in Asia. That was the extent of it. And I thought, I wonder where she's going. And that was it. We got in the car and drove away. But it was sort of enough of a little puzzle for me that it stuck with me. But before, I guess a year before that, I made one more trip back to Asia, because there was parts of Thailand I hadn't been to where the Death Railway was built that I needed to visit for Empress of Asia. And I was traveling with a friend, and we were going to go across to the eastern border and go into Cambodia and see Angkor Wat, but he was too sick to make the trip. So for some reason, all those former French Indochina countries have sort of lingered just beyond reachability as this sort of very mysterious destinations that a lot of people I know have been to, but I haven't quite made it. And then a couple of years later, this is a very convoluted story, but I wish there was a more exciting story for how this book came from, but it's really just a collection of ideas all munched together. We moved to Penticton, my wife and I, which has a fantastic used bookstore. And one of the first books I bought there was a big, thick paperback called Monkey, the Epic Folktale of China, which is such a great title. And on page 14, the Monkey King, who's gallivanting around with his subjects, suddenly gets extremely depressed and sits down on the hillside and says, "Oh, I've just realized I'm mortal. That means I'm going to die." And all the monkeys sit around and say, "Yeah, that's true." They're all very sad for a full paragraph. And then he leaps to his feet and says, "Well, I'm going to go down the mountain and travel to the ends of the earth until I defeat the doom of death." And it immediately struck me, well, maybe that's what my woman in hoop skirts was doing. She was clearly far from home. And the whole quest for a spring of eternal youth was born. And the very next day, the book was written. No, it wasn't. It took 2.5 years. I only wish that were the case. In 2007, I made one trip back. I went, well, not back to Vietnam and Laos for the first time for me, but back to Asia. I'd written a lot of details. I had all the characters kind of sketched out, but she does end up in the village that's mentioned at the end of that fable, and a lot of time is spent there. So I really needed, I read lots of translated historical texts and got a really good sense of, I thought anyway, of the time and the place and what people would have been talking about. But just the real on-the-ground sort of gritty details of life in an upcountry village, I needed to see that for myself. So I flew into Luang Prabang and then took a trek up with a guide out of Luang Prabang and spent a few days in different villages and just constantly writing down every single detail in my greasy little notebook. And for whatever reason, Henri was always talking into my ear. And I got a lot of Henri quotes just sort of verbatim that I didn't even necessarily ask for, but he was kind enough to provide them. And a lot of them ended up in the finished copy of the book. So now this is audience participation. What's interesting about
I hate that.
What's interesting about northern Laos and Thailand and Burma is that a lot of, you've probably heard of the hill tribes of these countries, and a lot of tourists, you know, go, myself included, go on tours to see the different hill tribes, and they all wear various, very diverse ethnic costumes, and they're all originally nomadic groups from China that sort of came down into those countries in the last 400 or 500 years. But because they were, you know, sort of evolved their own customs and their own dress and even their own languages in these great tracts of southern China, and then came down and were sort of scrunched at different elevations on these hills. You can walk for a day and meet, you know, 5 or 6 different tribes. And my guide, someone would just be walking along, you know, in shorts and flip-flops, and my guide would know how to say hello to him in any one of these 6 languages. And I'd say, well, how do you know? Oh, well, he's Hmong, because he's kind of green. I couldn't tell that he was kind of green, but it was clear enough to him. So when you're in Luang Prabang, which is populated by lowland Lao, who are mostly, you know, wet rice farmers, and you have a really good meal at a restaurant, and you pay your money, and then you want to say to the proprietor, well, thank you. Now this is where you participate. You say, Kop Dalai Lai. Can you say that? Kop Dalai. That's good. Kop Dalai Lai. Well, there's 5 of you and only one person's talking. Now, if you head up into the first villages, you're probably going to meet Kamu people. And you have a nice lunch with them, and it's very similar. I think the languages must have rubbed off on each a little bit. You say, Koping Namai Mai. You try that?
Koping Namai Mai.
Thank you. These gentlemen are very quiet over here. I don't know what they're waiting for. But the best one, I think, is when you head up to the next village. And I spent time in 2 villages, both called Moktung. One was the Kamu village, and the next one was 100 meters further up the path. It was Hmong village, also called Moktung. And if you want to say thank you to them, you say, Oa Cha. Yeah, it's a good one, eh? So as you go out again, you can say to Tony, thanks for a great event. Oa Cha. And she alone, out of everyone here, will know what you're talking about.